The heavy doors of the private hospital room opened slowly, and everyone turned their heads inside the room. Billionaire Edward Graves sat in his golden wheelchair, his body thin, his skin pale, and his breath slow. The machines around him beeped. Quietly, their screens full of numbers only the doctors could understand. He had spent millions on treatments, but nothing worked. Every doctor said the same words. There's no cure outside the tall windows. The city lights glowed, but inside the room there was only the smell of medicine and the cold hum of machines. Nurses moved carefully, afraid to make any mistake in front of the most powerful man. In the city, Edward was a man who once commanded entire empires, but now he could not even walk to the window without help. His wealth was untouched, but his body was failing him day by day. That night, something unusual happened. The nurse at the door stepped aside for someone, not a doctor, not a politician, not a man in a suit. It was a boy, no older than 16. He had no medical bag, no white coat, only a small wooden box in his hands. He walked straight towards the billionaire's bed with steady steps. The billionaire's assistant moved forward quickly, blocking the boy. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" he demanded, but the boy didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Edward Graves. There was something strange in his gaze. Calm yet unshakable, as if he had seen pain greater than this room could hold. Edward raised his hand, stopping his assistant. "Let him speak," he said with a tired voice. Curious about this boy who dared to walk in without fear, the boy finally spoke. "I can cure you for a second." Silence filled the room. Then the billionaire laughed. A deep, rough laugh that echoed off the golden walls. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of disbelief and arrogance. "You? Cure me? The world's best doctors have tried for years and failed. And you, a child, think you can do it?" Edward said, shaking his head. He leaned back in his chair, smiling with mocking amusement. "Tell you what," he said, "if you cure me, I'll give you $1 million. The nurses glanced at each other, some smiling nervously, thinking this was a cruel joke. The assistant smirked. Sure, the boy would turn red and leave. But the boy's face stayed calm. He looked at the billionaire and replied without hesitation. "Prepare the check." The words hit the room like a sudden clap of thunder. The assistant froze, his smirk fading. Edward's laughter slowly died. In his throat, replaced by a flicker of interest. This boy wasn't joking. There was no stutter in his voice, no sign of fear. "What makes you so sure, boy?" Edward asked, leaning forward in his wheelchair. The boy stepped closer, placing the wooden box gently on the table beside the bed. He spoke in a low voice, almost like a warning. "Because I've cured worse than you. But only if you truly want to live." The billionaire studied the boy carefully. His clothes were simple, his hands thin but steady, and yet there was something about him, something unexplainable. Edward had faced ruthless businessmen, corrupt politicians, even death threats. But never had he felt this kind of quiet power coming from someone so young. The assistant whispered urgently, "Sir, this is nonsense. Let me remove him." Edward raised his hand again. "No. I want to see where this goes." The boy slowly opened the wooden box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded red cloth, was a small vial filled with a golden liquid that seemed to glow under the hospital lights. The nurses gasped softly, unsure if it was real or a trick of their eyes. The boy's voice was calm, but carried a weight that made everyone listen. "This is not from here," he said, "and it will save you if you are willing to pay the real price." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Real price? I told you, $1 million. The boy shook his head. "Money means nothing to me," he said. "The price is something you are not ready to give. But without it, you will die." A chill passed through the room. For the first time in years, Edward Graves felt something he thought was long gone: fear. The boy's eyes did not move away from him, and in that moment, the billionaire knew this was no ordinary visitor. Part 1 ends as the golden light from the vial reflects in Edward's eyes. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered to him, "Your life is about to change forever." The golden glow from the vial lingered in the air like a quiet promise. Edward Graves leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving the boy. He was used to people begging for his help, not offering theirs, but this boy stood there with no fear, no greed, only that strange confidence. "What is your name?" Edward finally asked. The boy answered simply, "Daniel." No last name, no introduction, just Daniel. The billionaire's assistant scoffed. "That's it? Daniel? No credentials? No proof you can help?" Daniel ignored him, his attention fixed on Edward. "I didn't come here to prove anything," Daniel said quietly. "I came to give you a choice." Edward tilted his head. "A choice between what?" "Between life and death." Daniel replied without hesitation. The words were not loud, but they struck everyone in the room. Even the nurses stopped pretending to work and turned to listen. The assistant stepped forward again. "Enough. This is a waste of time," but Edward raised a hand, silencing him. Something about Daniel's calm voice made Edward want to know more. "What makes you think you can do what the best doctors can't?" Edward asked. Daniel's eyes darkened for a moment, as if remembering something far away. "Because I already have," he said. Edward leaned forward slightly, his curiosity deepening. Daniel continued, his tone steady. "In my village, there was a woman. She was dying, her skin pale, her breath short, her body failing, just like yours." Edward frowned. "What happened to her?" Daniel's voice lowered. "Everyone gave up on her. The doctor said she would be gone in days. But she is still alive." The billionaire's assistant scoffed again. "Coincidence?" But Daniel didn't flinch. "Not coincidence. I cured her." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the room again. Edward studied him. "And how did you cure her?" Daniel looked down at the wooden box, his fingers brushing over the faded red cloth inside. "This," he said, "came from a place most people will never see." Edward raised an eyebrow. "And where is that?" Daniel met his eyes, far beyond where money can take you. The words hung in the air for the first time. Edward felt a small spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Intrigue. This boy wasn't trying to sell him something, and he wasn't afraid to walk away. That alone made Edward want to hear the rest. "Tell me about this place," Edward said slowly. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he told a story, his voice calm but painting vivid images in the minds of everyone listening. "When I was 10, I was lost in the forest behind my village," he began. "It was night, and I had no food, no light, only the sound of water somewhere ahead. I followed it and found a small spring glowing faintly in the dark. The water was clear, but it wasn't normal. It gave off a light like the vial you just saw." Edward narrowed his eyes. "And you drank it?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, and I saw things." "What kind of things?" Edward asked. "Faces of people I had never met. People I would one day save," Daniel said softly. "They showed me how to heal, what to take from the earth, and what to give back in return." The assistant muttered, "This is madness." But Edward stayed silent, his gaze locked on the boy. Daniel's eyes seemed older than his years, filled with something that didn't belong in a child. "The spring is hidden," Daniel continued. "It gives life, but it demands balance. If it heals someone who has caused great harm, that person must restore what they took, or the healing will fade." Edward leaned back, his mind turning. "Balance," he repeated. Tasting the word, "Yes," Daniel said. "And you, Mr. Graves, have taken much." The words were sharp. Like a knife sliding between pride and truth, the assistant bristled. "You don't know anything about him." But Daniel's gaze didn't move from Edward's face. "I know enough," he said, "and I know why you are sick." Edward's jaw tightened. "Why am I sick then?" Daniel stepped closer, the golden light from the vial catching in his eyes. "Because you have spent your life building walls of gold, while leaving broken lives behind them." The billionaire felt something shift in his chest, a strange mix of anger and shame. No one spoke to him like this. But this boy didn't care about power or money, and that made his words impossible to ignore. Daniel closed the wooden box gently. "I can cure you," he said again, "but you will have to give something far more valuable than $1 million. Edward's fingers tightened on the armrest of his wheelchair. "And if I refuse," Daniel's expression didn't change, "then your body will fail within a year. Maybe less." The billionaire's eyes narrowed, but there was a glint of fear in them now for a moment. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the machines. Then Edward spoke. "Come back tomorrow. I'll give you my answer." Daniel gave a small nod, turned, and walked out without looking back. The assistant hurried after him, but stopped at the doorway for just a moment as Daniel stepped into the hallway. The golden light seemed to follow him, and Edward, watching from his chair, couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's story, as impossible as it sounded, might just be true. Part 2 ends with Edward whispering to himself, "Far beyond where money can take you." What did he mean? The next evening, the air in Edward Graves' private hospital room felt heavier than usual. Outside, the city glowed with wealth and life, but inside there was a tense stillness. The billionaire sat in his wheelchair, wearing his usual silk robe, his assistant at his side. He looked toward the door more often than usual, as if waiting for someone. At exactly 7 o'clock, the door opened. Daniel walked in, carrying the same small wooden box. No doctors followed him, no security, no audience. Only him. He stopped in front of Edward and spoke without greeting. "Have you decided?" Edward studied him, his hands resting on the wheelchair's arms. "I have," the billionaire said, his voice low. "I will hear your method, but I'm not agreeing to anything until I see proof." Daniel nodded slowly, as if expecting that answer. "You will have proof," he said. "But first, I need to know, do you truly want to live?" The assistant scoffed. "Of course he does. Why else would we be here?" But Daniel didn't look at the assistant. "This question is not for you," he said, his voice calm but firm. His eyes stayed on Edward, waiting for a long moment. Edward didn't answer. He thought about his fortune, his companies, his influence, all of it useless if his body gave up. Finally, he said, "Yes, I want to live." Daniel gave a single nod, then placed the wooden box on the side table. He opened it slowly, revealing the vial of golden liquid. Its light faint but alive. From another cloth pouch inside the box, he took a small clay cup. He poured only a few drops of the golden liquid into it. Then, from a small jar, he added a thick, dark powder. The moment the two mixed, the cup released a strange, sharp scent, part sweet, part metallic. Edward frowned. "What is that?" Daniel answered, "Your first test." The assistant stepped forward. "Hold on. You're not drinking anything from this kid. It could be poison." Daniel's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the air. "If I wanted him dead, I would not need poison." Edward smirked slightly at that, but his curiosity won over his caution. "What happens if I drink it?" he asked. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "It will hurt," he said simply. "It will feel like your illness is trying to burn its way out of you. But if you endure it, your body will be ready for the real cure." The assistant shook his head. "Sir, this is insane." But Edward raised a hand to silence him. He took the clay cup from Daniel's hands. The golden light shimmered faintly in the liquid. As if alive, Edward held the cup close, hesitated for a heartbeat, then drank. The taste was bitter, metallic, almost impossible to swallow, but he forced it down in one gulp. At first, nothing happened. Then, like a slow spark catching fire, pain began to spread from his chest outward. It grew hotter, sharper, until it felt like every vein was filled with burning glass. Edward gasped, clutching the arms of his chair. The assistant moved toward him in panic. "Call the doctors." But Daniel blocked his path, his voice calm but unyielding. "No. Let him endure." The pain grew worse, and Edward's vision blurred. It felt like something inside him was tearing free. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His breathing came in short, ragged bursts. He wanted to shout for help, but a part of him remembered Daniel's warning. If you want your life, endure. Minutes stretched like hours. The burning spread to his arms, his legs, his spine. His fingers dug into the wheelchair's arms hard enough to leave marks. The assistant cursed under his breath, pacing helplessly. The nurses stood frozen near the wall, unsure whether to act or obey. Daniel knelt beside the billionaire, his eyes never leaving Edward's face. "You've spent your life buying power," Daniel said softly. "But you can't buy this. You have to earn it." Edward wanted to argue, but the pain made speech impossible. Then, something strange happened. The burning began to shift. It was still painful, but now there was a strange relief with it. It's like a storm passing and leaving fresh air behind. Edward's breaths slowed, though his body was shaking. He looked down and saw faint dark lines on his forearm, thin, branching marks, almost like veins of ink beneath the skin. Daniel glanced at them, his tone flat. "The sickness has roots. It's been growing for years." That was the first cut. Edward's head dropped back against the chair, exhausted. He had endured more pain in the last 15 minutes than in the last 10 years. Yet, deep inside, he felt lighter, as if a small weight had been lifted. Daniel stood, placing the empty cup back in the box. "That was only the first step," he said. "You passed, for now." Edward raised his head slowly, his voice hoarse. "And if I hadn't?" Daniel met his eyes. "Then you would already be dead." The room went silent. The hum of the machines suddenly louder. The assistant stared at the boy in disbelief. Edward, still catching his breath, realized something important. The boy had not lied. Whatever this was, it was real. Daniel began to close the wooden box. "I'll return for the second step tomorrow," he said. "But next time, it won't be just pain. It will cost you something you cannot buy back." Edward watched him leave, the strange marks on his skin still faintly visible. And for the first time, the billionaire wondered if the price Daniel spoke of might be something far worse than money. The night after the first test was long for Edward Graves. He sat in his golden wheelchair near the wide glass window, watching the city below. The pain in his body had faded into a dull ache, but the strange dark lines remained faintly visible under his skin. Every time he looked at them, he remembered Daniel's words, "The sickness has roots." That was the first cut. His assistant, Michael, paced behind him. "I don't trust that boy, sir." "He nearly killed you," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. Edward didn't answer, his eyes still on the city. "You should let me call in specialists, real ones," Michael continued. Edward finally turned his head. "Michael, last night, for the first time in years, I felt something change. Not in my head, not in my mind. In my body." The assistant stopped pacing. "You mean? You think he's real?" Edward's voice was quiet but certain. I can't afford to ignore him." The next evening, Daniel returned. He carried the same small wooden box, his steps unhurried. Edward noticed something about him. The boy never looked around the room, never seemed impressed by the gold, the art, or the expensive machines. It was as if none of it mattered to him. Without wasting time, Daniel placed the box on the table and sat opposite Edward. "You passed the first step," he said. "Now comes the second, the price." Edward raised an eyebrow. "You already named the price. $1 million. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. Money is nothing. I told you before. The real price is something you are not ready to give." Michael moved closer, suspicious. "What is it then?" "Land, assets, a company share." Daniel's gaze shifted to him briefly, then back to Edward. "I don't want anything you own," Daniel said. "I want something you've taken." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Taken?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "Your sickness didn't come from the air or from bad luck. It came from the lives you've destroyed to build your empire." The room went quiet. Edward leaned forward, his voice hard. "You speak like you know me." Daniel's tone was calm. "I know enough. I know about the workers you underpaid, the families you drove out of their homes for your buildings, the rivals you crushed until they had nothing left." Michael stepped forward, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You're accusing him without proof." Daniel ignored him. "You can be cured, but you must return what you took to the people you took it from." Edward gave a short, bitter laugh. "That's impossible. Some of those people are gone. Some hate me. Some wouldn't even take my help." Daniel's voice sharpened. "Then find a way, because the cure will not work without it." Edward stared at the boy. "You want me to undo decades of business deals." "I want you to undo decades of damage," Daniel corrected. For the first time, Edward's confident voice faltered. "And if I don't," Daniel didn't blink, "then the marks on your skin will spread. Slowly at first, then faster. Your body will shut down and no doctor will be able to stop it." Edward leaned back, silent, his hands gripping the armrests. He had faced corporate wars, political threats, even extortion, but never a demand like this. The assistant broke the silence. "Sir, he's manipulating you. This is some morality trick." But Edward didn't reply to Michael. He looked at Daniel and asked, "And if I agree?" Daniel's expression softened only slightly. "Then I will give you the full cure." Edward frowned. "And what does?" That involved Daniel's answer was simple. Pain again. But this time, not in your body. Edward didn't like the sound of that. "What do you mean?" Daniel's voice dropped lower. "You'll have to look people in the eye and admit what you did to them. You'll have to face their anger and still give them back what you took." The billionaire's jaw tightened. "I don't apologize." Daniel didn't smile, didn't look impressed. "Then you don't live." The words cut through the air like a blade. Edward felt the weight of them, a clear, sharp truth he couldn't shake. He had spent his life hiding behind walls of power and money. But now those walls meant nothing. After a long silence, Edward finally spoke. "I'll think about it." Daniel stood, picking up his box. "You don't have long. The sickness grows while you wait." He walked to the door, then stopped and looked back at Edward. "One more thing. This isn't charity. When you give back, you must mean it, or the cure will fail." Edward said nothing as Daniel left. Michael shut the door and turned toward him. "You're not seriously considering this, are you?" Edward didn't answer. He just looked at the faint marks on his arm, darker than they were the night before. Part 4 ends with Edward whispering to himself, "Return what I took." But where do I even start? The next morning, Edward Graves sat at the long dining table in his penthouse. The breakfast in front of him, fresh fruit, warm bread, imported coffee, went untouched. He stared out the glass wall at the city skyline, but his thoughts were far away. Michael, his assistant, stood nearby, reading through the day's schedule. "And you have a meeting with the real estate board at noon?" Michael said. Edward didn't respond. "Sir?" "I'm canceling it," Edward said quietly. Michael frowned. "That's the third meeting you've canceled this week. What's going on?" Edward didn't look up. You heard what the boy said. Michael set down his tablet. Yes. And I told you, it's nonsense. He's playing some moral game with you. Edward's voice was sharp now. Michael, last night the mark spread further up my arm. I saw it in the mirror. That boy wasn't lying. The assistant hesitated. Even if he's telling the truth, his cure means tearing apart everything you've built. Do you really think you can give back everything? The man you are, Edward interrupted. The man I am is dying. The words hung in the air like a cold wind. Michael finally stepped back, unsure what to say. Later that day, Daniel arrived again. Edward was already waiting. The golden light from the evening sun spilling across the room. You came, Edward said. His voice calm but tense. Daniel placed the wooden box on the table and sat. I said I would, for. A moment they sat in silence. Then Edward spoke. I've been thinking about your price. It's not as simple as you make it sound. Daniel tilted his head slightly. It's not meant to be simple. Edward let out a short laugh. I can give away money. I can sign over property, but facing those people, the ones I hurt. That's different. Daniel's gaze was steady. That's the point. The billionaire's jaw tightened. You expect me to stand in front of people who would rather spit in my face than take my help? Yes, Daniel said without hesitation. Edward leaned forward. And if they refuse what I give? Daniel's reply was soft but firm. Then you still give. Because this isn't about their forgiveness. It's about your balance. Edward's eyes narrowed. You talk like you know my life better than I do. Daniel's voice didn't change. I know enough to see the weight you've been carrying. Not on your back, but in your blood. The sickness feeds on it. Michael, who had been standing in the corner, finally spoke. This is insane. Sir, you don't need this boy. We can find another way. Edward turned to him slowly. There is no other way. Not anymore. Daniel opened the box, revealing the golden vial again. Its glow seemed stronger now, almost pulsing with life. This will finish the cure, Daniel said. But it will only work if you've begun to restore what you took. Edward stared at the vial for a long time. You're asking me to break myself in front of people who hate me? Daniel shook his head. I'm asking you to rebuild yourself. In front of people who will finally see you. The billionaire's hand tightened into a fist. I built my empire by never showing weakness. Daniel leaned forward slightly, and now it's killing you. The words were simple, but they hit Edward like a hammer. For years, it measured his worth by how untouchable he was. But now, every breath reminded him he was not untouchable at all. Finally, Edward asked, how do I even start? Daniel didn't hesitate. Start with the one who still waits for you. Even if you don't know it. Edward's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Daniel's eyes softened for the first time that night. You have a daughter. The billionaire froze. His voice dropped. That's not your business. Daniel's tone stayed calm. It's the first piece. You can give her back what she lost. A father. The air in the room thickened. Michael glanced between them, sensing a dangerous line being crossed. Edward's voice was low and tense. You know nothing about her. Daniel's reply was, quiet. I know she hasn't stopped hoping you'll call. Edward looked away, his throat tight. It had been years since he'd spoken to her. Years of excuses buried under work, pride, and silence. But hearing Daniel speak it aloud brought back a sharp ache he thought he'd buried. Daniel stood, closing the box. Tomorrow, you start. Or the sickness wins. Edward looked up sharply. You think you can order me around? Daniel's answer was steady. I'm not ordering you. I'm giving you the only choice left. As Daniel walked to the door, Edward called after him. And if I refuse? Daniel didn't turn back. Then prepare your will. The door closed softly. Leaving Edward in the fading light, he sat there for a long time, staring at the city he had ruled for decades. But all he could see was a small face from years ago. A little girl holding his hand before power had replaced her place in his life. Part 5 ends with Edward whispering to himself, "Maybe she's where I start." The next morning, Edward Graves did something no one in his staff had seen him do in years. He canceled all his business meetings, all his lunches with investors, even his private dinner with the mayor. Instead, he told Michael, "Find her." Michael didn't need to ask who. He knew Edward meant his daughter, Claire, but his voice still carried doubt, "Sir. After all these years, she may not want to see you." Edward stared out the window at the busy streets below. "She doesn't have to want it. I need to try." By late afternoon, Michael returned with an address. A small, modest house on the edge of the city. Nothing like the marble towers Edward called home. Edward insisted on going himself. No driver, no bodyguards. Michael drove in silence. The golden glow of the setting sun stretching across the streets. When they reached the house, Edward's chest tightened. It was quiet. With a small garden in front, he sat in the car for a full minute, gripping his cane. "Are you ready for this?" Michael asked. Edward took a deep breath. "No. But I'm going anyway." The door opened before he could knock. Claire stood there, older than the little girl he remembered, but with the same sharp eyes. She froze when she saw him. "Dad?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Edward's throat felt dry. "Yes, it's me." There was no smile, no rush into his arms, only silence. Then she stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The inside was warm, lived in, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread. Edward sat in a small armchair while Claire stayed standing. Arms crossed. "You haven't called me in 10 years, she said flatly. Edward nodded slowly. "I know, and now you show up. Why?" Edward wanted to tell her everything about Daniel, the sickness, the cure. But he realized how strange it would sound. Instead, he said, "Because I've made mistakes. I've taken more than I've given. I want to start giving back. Starting with you." Claire's expression didn't soften. "You think just showing up is enough?" "No," Edward admitted, "but I want to try, even if you don't forgive me." For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then she said quietly, "I don't need your money. I needed you." Those words hit him harder than any business defeat he'd ever faced. He nodded again. "I know," he said softly. "I can't change the past, but I want to be here now." They talked for over an hour, not about business, not about wealth, but about the years they'd lost. When Edward finally left, his chest felt both heavy and lighter at the same time. And when he got home, Daniel was waiting. "You saw her?" Daniel said. More like a statement than a question. Edward nodded. "Yes." Daniel's gaze moved to Edward's arms. The dark marks had faded slightly. "This is how the cure works," Daniel said. "Every life you heal, every wrong you try to make right, removes the sickness from you over the next week." Edward began to do something unthinkable for a man of his reputation. He reached out to former employees he had underpaid. He returned stolen land to families he had driven out. He even visited an old rival in a retirement home and offered to restore what he had taken. Some slammed doors in his face, some cursed him, but others, shocked by his sincerity, accepted. And each time, the marks on his skin grew lighter. But the real test came on the 7th day. Daniel arrived with the wooden box again. "It's time for the final step," he said. Edward, now stronger than he had been in months, sat straighter. In his chair, "What happens now?" Daniel opened the box and held out the golden vial. "This time, you drink it all. But if you have not truly meant your actions, it will destroy you instead of healing you." Michael stepped forward in alarm. "Sir, you can't, Edward." Raised a hand. "I've made my choice." He took the vial from Daniel. Feeling its strange warmth in his palm, the golden liquid shimmered in the light. For a moment, he hesitated, not because of fear, but because he understood what this moment meant. If he drank and survived, his life would be his again. If he failed, it would end here. Edward drank. The liquid burned like fire. But this time, the pain was different. It wasn't the sharp agony of the first test. It was deep, pulling at something inside him. Memories flashed, the faces of people he had hurt, the deals he had made, the lives he had ruined. But mixed in with them now were the faces of those he had tried to make amends with. The pain surged, then began to fade. Edward opened his eyes, breathing hard. Daniel was watching him closely. The marks on Edward's skin were gone. "You've done enough," Daniel said quietly. "You will live." Edward leaned back in his chair, exhausted but lighter than he had felt in years. But Daniel's expression was unreadable. "What is it?" Edward asked. Daniel closed the box and said, "There is still one thing left, and it's the hardest of all." Part 6 ends with Daniel stepping toward the door. "We finish tomorrow, and then your debt will truly be paid." The next morning, the sky was gray, heavy clouds hanging over the city. Edward Graves sat in his study, waiting. He had slept better than he had in years, the pain in his body gone, the dark marks erased. But Daniel's last words from the night before kept echoing in his mind. There is still one thing left. And it's the hardest of all. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door opened. Daniel walked in with the same wooden box, but this time it remained closed in his hands. Edward studied him. "You said I was cured," Edward began. Daniel nodded. "You are. Your body is healed. But the cure was never just for your body." Edward frowned. "Then what's left?" Daniel's voice was quiet but sharp. "You've returned money, property, and dignity to people you wronged. But there's one debt you haven't paid. The one to yourself." Edward leaned back in his chair. "To myself." Daniel stepped closer. "You've spent years hiding behind gold and glass towers, convincing yourself you are untouchable. You've built walls to keep the world out. But those walls also kept you trapped." Edward looked away. "That's just the price of power." "No," Daniel said firmly. "That was fear." For the first time, Edward didn't argue. Daniel placed the wooden box on the desk and slowly opened it. Inside was not the golden vial, but a single envelope, sealed in red wax. Edward stared at it. "What is this?" Daniel slid it toward him. "Your last task. You must write a letter to someone you could never face in person. Tell them the truth, all of it. No excuses, no lies." Edward hesitated. "Who?" Daniel's gaze was steady. "You already know." And Edward did. His hand trembled slightly. As he reached for a pen, the name came to him immediately. Henry Cole. Henry had been his closest friend decades ago, until Edward had betrayed him in a deal that destroyed Henry's business and reputation. He had never apologized, never spoken to him again. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Edward had always known that was the one wound he'd never dared touch. For over an hour, the study was silent except for the scratching of the pen. Edward wrote of the greed, the fear of losing power, the lies he told himself. He wrote of the regret that had grown heavier every year. And he ended with the only words that mattered: "I'm sorry." When he finished, he sealed the envelope and slid it across the desk to Daniel. Daniel didn't open it. "I'm not delivering this for you," he said. "You will." Edward froze. "What?" Daniel's tone didn't change. "You will go to him yourself. If he slams the door in your face, you will still have faced him. That's the real cure, not running from the truth." Edward sat back, thinking of all the boardrooms he had dominated, the battles he had won, and yet the idea of knocking on Henry Cole's door made him feel like a small, guilty child. Still, he stood. "When?" he asked. Daniel gave the faintest smile. Now, the drive felt longer than it was when they reached a quiet neighborhood far from the city's towers. Edward stepped out alone. He walked to the small, weathered house and knocked the door. Opened slowly. Henry Cole stood there, older, with lines of hard years etched into his face. His eyes widened in surprise. "Edward Graves," he said flatly. Edward swallowed hard. "Yes, it's me. I came to tell you something." He handed Henry the envelope. Henry looked at it, then at Edward. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Henry opened it, read the words inside. His hands trembled slightly. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. You actually said it," Henry whispered. Edward nodded. "I'm sorry, Henry, for everything." There was a long pause. Then Henry stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly. Edward walked inside, feeling a weight lift from his chest. Heavier than the sickness, heavier than the years. This was the real cure. Later that evening, Edward returned to his penthouse to find Daniel waiting. The boy looked at him, and for the first time, Edward saw him smile. "It's done," Daniel said. Edward nodded. "Yes, it's done." He reached into his desk and took out a checkbook. "I owe you $1 million, Edward said, beginning to write. But when he slid the check toward Daniel, the boy didn't take it. "I told you I don't want your money," Daniel said. Closing the checkbook, Edward frowned. "Then why did you come?" Daniel picked up the wooden box, holding it close, because the spring doesn't just heal bodies, it heals people. And sometimes, it sends someone to make sure the right person gets a second chance. Edward looked at him for a long moment. "Will I see you again?" Daniel smiled faintly. "No, but you'll feel the difference every day you choose to live like this." He turned and walked toward the door. The golden light from the box seemed to glow brighter as he stepped into the hall, and then he was gone. Edward stood alone in the quiet room. He glanced at the city lights outside. They looked different now, not like trophies, but like lives still waiting to be touched. Part 7 ends with Edward whispering to himself, "Prepare the check." For the world this time,